All right, here we go. We are going to start out with Crispin, Cross of Lead, chapters 1 and 2 today. Crispin, Cross of Lead is a book of historical fiction. The writer is Avi. And that picture on the first page there, that will matter later to the story. Now, the first page here, on the first page, it says England AD 1377. So that's the time period and the setting where the story is taking place. AD stands for Anno Domini, which is a Latin phrase that means in the year of our Lord. So right now we are in the year 2021 AD. So this story took place nearly 700 years ago. Here we go. In the midst of life comes death. How often did our village priest preach those words? Yet I have also heard that in the midst of death comes life. If this be a riddle, so was my life. We can do this a little better here. Chapter 1. The day after my mother died, the priest and I wrapped her body in a gray shroud and carried her to the village church. Our burden was not great. In life she had been a small woman with little strength. Death made her even less. Her name had been Asta. Since our cottage was at the village fringe, the priest and I bore her remains along the narrow, rutted road that led to the cemetery. A steady, hissing rain had turned the ground to clinging mud. No bird sang, no bells tolled. The sun hid behind the dark and lowering clouds. As we passed village fields where people were at work in the rain and mud, no one knelt. They simply stared. As they had shunned my mother in life, so they shunned her now. As for me, as I often did, felt ashamed. It was as if I contained an unnamed sin that made me less than nothing in their eyes. Other than the priest, my mother had no friends. She was often taunted by the villagers. Still, I had thought of her as a woman of beauty, as perhaps all children think upon their mothers. The burial took place among the other paupers' graves in the walled cemetery behind our church. It was there the priest and I dug her grave in water-laden clay. There was no coffin. We laid her down with her feet toward the east, so when the day of judgment came, she would, may God grant it, rise up to face Jerusalem. As the priest chanted the Latin prayers, whose meaning I barely understood, I knelt by his side and knew that God had taken away the one person I could claim as my own. But his will be done. No sooner did we cover my mother's remains with heavy earth than John Aycliffe, the steward of the manor, appeared outside the cemetery walls. Though I had not seen him, he must have been watching us from astride his horse. "Asta's son, come," he said to me. Head bowed, I drew close. "Look at me," he commanded, reaching down and forcing my head up with a sharp slap of his gloved hand beneath my chin. It was always hard for me to look on others. To look on John Aycliffe was hardest of all. His black-bearded face, hard, sharp eyes, and frowning lips forever scowled at me. When he deigned to look in my direction, he had nothing but contempt. For me to pass near was to invite his scorn, his kicks, and sometimes his blows. No one ever accused John Aycliffe of any kindness. In the absence of Lord Furnival, he was in charge of the manor, the laws, and the peasants. To be caught in some small transgression, missing a day of work, speaking harshly of his rule, failing to attend Mass, brought an unforgiving penalty. It could be a whipping, a clipping of the ear, imprisonment, or a cut-off hand. For poaching a stag, John the ale-maker's son was put to death on the common gallows. As judge, jury, and willing executioner, Aycliffe had but to give the word and the offender's life was forfeit. We all lived in fear of him. Aycliffe stared at me for a long while, as if in search of something. All he said, however, was, "With your mother gone, you're required to deliver your ox to the manor house tomorrow. It will serve as the death tax." "But, sir," I said, for my speech was slow and ill-formed, "if I do, I won't be able to work the fields." "Then starve," he said, and rode away without a backward glance. Father Quinnell whispered into my ear. "Come to church, Asta's son. We'll pray." Too upset, I only shook my head. "God will protect you," he said, resting his hand on my shoulder, "as he now protects your mother." His words only distressed me more. Was death my only hope? Seeking to escape my heart's cage of sorrow, I rushed off toward the forest. Barely aware of the earth beneath my feet or the roof of trees above, I paid no mind into what I ran, or that my sole garment, a gray wool tunic, tore on brambles and bushes. Nor did I care that my leather shoes, catching roots or stones, kept tripping me, causing me to fall. Each time I picked myself up and rushed on, panting, crying. Deeper and deeper into the ancient woods I went, past thick bracken and stately oaks, until I tripped and fell again. This time, as God in his wisdom would have it, my head struck stone. Stunned, I lay upon the decaying earth, fingers clotting rutsching leaves, cold rain drenching me. As daylight faded, I was entombed in a world darker than any night could bring. Chapter 2. Long past the hour of Compline, the last prayers of the night, a sound aroused me to a confused state of wakefulness. Because of the utter darkness and the painful throbbing in my head, I knew not where I was. Though unable to see, I could smell the air and realized I wasn't at home. Nor was I in the fields where I often slept with the ox. Only when I sniffed again did I become sure of the woodland smells and cloying air. The rain had ceased, but it was as if night itself had begun to sweat. Then in a burst I recalled my mother's death and burial, my leaving the cemetery and the priest, my plunge into the woods. I remembered tripping, falling. Putting a hand to my forehead, I felt a welt and crust of hardened blood. Though my touch made me wince, the pain banished the remaining dizziness. I realized that I was in the forest and lost. My tunic was cold and wet. Lifting my head, I looked about. Midst the tangle of trees, I saw a flickering light. Puzzled, I came upon my knees to see better, but save that flame, all was murk and midnight mist, and silence lay as thick as death. In haste, I made the sign of the cross and murmured protective prayers. Mind, godly folk had no business beyond their lawful homes at such a time. Night was a mask for outlaws, hungry wolves, the devil and his minions. Then who or what, I asked myself, had caused the sound that had brought me to my senses? It was my curiosity, another name my mother had often said, for Satan, that made me want to see what was there. Despite fear of discovery, I crept through the woods. When I came as near to the light as I dared, I raised my head and tensed my legs, ready to flee if necessary. 2 men were standing in the clearing. One was John Aycliffe. In one hand he held a fluttering torch. As always, a sword was at his side. The second man I'd never seen before. Dressed like a gentleman with a face of older years, he wore a hood attached to a flowing cape that hung down behind his legs. Gray hair reached his shoulders. His blue overtunic was long, quilted, and dark, with yellow clasps that gleamed in the torchlight. Within the circle of light, I also saw the fine head of a horse. I assumed it was the stranger's. The 2 men were talking, straining to listen. Forgetful of the danger, I rose up from the bushes where I hid. As I looked on, the stranger pushed aside his cape and brought forth a wallet. From it, he drew a parchment packet affixed with red wax seals. He handed it to Aycliffe. The steward unfolded it. The parchment was wide and filled with what looked like writing. 3 more red seals and ribbons dangled from the bottom edge. Passing the stranger the torch so he could see better, Aycliffe took up the document and cast his eyes over it. "Well, by the bowels of Christ!" I heard him exclaim, even as he made the sign of the cross over his chest. "When will it happen?" "Well, if God wills, it will come soon," the stranger said. "Well, am I to act immediately?" Aycliffe asked the man. "Well, are you not her kin?" the stranger said. "Do you not see the consequences if you don't?" "Well, a great danger to us all." "Well, precisely. There could be those who will see it so and act accordingly. You'll be placed in danger too. As a frowning Aycliffe began to fold the document, he turned away, and when he shifted, he saw me. Our eyes met. My heart all but Asta's son, Aycliffe cried. The stranger whirled about. There! The steward shouted, pointing right at me. Throwing the document aside, he snatched back the torch, drew his sword, and began to run in my direction. Transfixed by fear, I stood rooted to the spot. Not until he came close to me did I turn and flee. But no sooner did I became ensnared in brambles that caught me in their thorny grasp. Though I struggled and pulled, it was to no avail. I was too well caught. All the while, Aycliffe was drawing closer, his face filled with hate. When he drew near, he lifted his sword and swung it down. In his haste, the sword's descending arc missed me, but cut the brambles so I could rip myself away before he could take another stroke. I ran on. Aycliffe continued to pursue me, sword and torch up. He would have caught me if I had not, in my blind panic, tumbled over a cliff. Though of no great height, it took me by such surprise I went hurtling through the air, crashing hard upon my side and rolling farther down a hill. I was stunned, my breath gone, but I had enough sense to roll over and look back. Above me, at some distance, I saw Aycliffe's torch, and his face peering down. When I realized he had no idea where he was, I dared not move. When his light finally retreated, did I pick myself up and flee? I ran as far as strength and breath allowed, halting only when my legs gave out. Then I threw myself upon the ground, gasping for breath. For the remainder of the night, I found little rest. Not only was I in fear of being found and made subject to the steward's wrath, I was still engulfed by grief at my mother's death. Then, too, I had turned from the priest when he had asked me to church. I had broken the curfew, too. Why, I'd even stolen church wine to ease my mother's pains before she died. In short, I was certain God was punishing me. Even as I waited for his next blow, I sought with earnest prayers forgiveness for my sinful life. Chapters 1 and 2 of Crispin, Cross of Lead.